Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Welcome to an Unsafe Space, a symposium on contemporary feminism, episode 2. The purpose of this symposium series is threefold: to showcase the value of rigorous dialogue on contemporary and contentious feminist topics from divergent worldviews, to highlight the sharp differences between opposing perspectives, as well as to expose mutual concerns and interests. Our topic today, abortion and bodily integrity. Thank you for joining us. With us are two leading feminist scholars and philosophers, pro-choice feminist Dr. Laurie J and pro-life feminist Dr. Melissa Moschella. Professor Shrage holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of California, San Diego, and is professor of philosophy at Florida International University. Her books include Abortion and Social Responsibility, Depolarizing the Debate, published by Oxford University Press, and Moral Dilemmas of Feminism. Professor Shrage is also published in numerous scholarly journals and contributed several pieces to the Stone series in the New York Times. She has also served as a series editor for Explorations in Contemporary Social Political Philosophy with Rowman and Littlefield. As a fellow in residence at the Edmund Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, and as a Lawrence Rockefeller visiting fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values. Thank you, Dr. Shrage, for being with us. Professor Moschella, a graduate of Harvard College, holds a PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. She is an associate professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America and a MacDonald Distinguished Fellow at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University School of Law. Professor Moschella is the author of To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, published by Cambridge University Press, and the author of numerous articles published in scholarly journals as well as popular media outlets, including Bioethics, the Journal of Medical Ethics, the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. She also serves on the editorial advisory board of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. Thank you, professors, for being with us. My name is Michele Sterlace, moderator of the event, along with Cecelia Lester sitting next to me. Cecelia holds a fine arts degree from RIT. She is the vice president and social media director of Feminists Choosing Life of New York, the host and organizer of this event. I am an attorney with an advanced law degree in conflict resolution from the Straus Institute at Pepperdine School of Law. I am currently serving as the executive director of Feminists Choosing Life of New York. Again, thank you all for joining us and for your willingness to engage in productive civil discussion. Our panelists will be presented with 4 questions to answer and then discuss. Their responses and conversation surrounding each one of these 4 questions will last about 10 minutes. At approximately 11:45, the format will open up for audience Q&A. Please submit your questions starting now if you'd like in the webinar's Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You are free to submit questions throughout the event. Questions will be fairly selected for both panelists. If you want a specific professor to answer your question, please say so. We encourage you to ask hard-hitting, provocative, provoking questions. So Cecelia will present the first 2 panel questions for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Michele. Professor Shrage, Professor Moschella, thank you very much for being here. It's great to meet you. Professor Shrage, I'm gonna start with you. The first question is, does a woman's right to bodily integrity and autonomy imply a right to abortion? Is legal abortion necessary to protect women's health? And what is the evidence for this claim?
Okay, thanks. I'm going to start with the second half of that question, but let me just first thank you, the organizers, for arranging this. We really ought to do some things like this more often. Very often when we talk about controversial issues, we tend to only want to talk with people who agree with us, and it's important to talk across these divides and to try to at least understand why we differ and where we might converge. So on that question about why abortion might be necessary to protect a woman's health, let me just give one example, and I know cases of this. A woman might find out she's pregnant. Maybe she's been diagnosed with cancer and has to begin radiation treatments. Maybe she's already begun radiation therapy, which of course would be probably already have been damaging to her fetus. If she stops or doesn't start radiation therapy, she might lose her own battle with cancer, and so she might need an abortion, so she can get the medical care she needs to treat her health. Another condition that's fairly common, it's actually not common, it's rare, but it occurs in pregnancy, is a condition called eclampsia with another condition called preeclampsia. And this can lead to very high blood pressure. Ultimately, a woman can die. Her bodily organs can shut down. She doesn't die. She can suffer long-term brain damage. And the only remedy for this is to end the pregnancy. And sometimes this tends to occur in late pregnancy, so after 20 weeks. And so sometimes there are different options depending on whether or not the fetus is viable. But sometimes it might occur before viability, and the only option is abortion. Another kind of case is sometimes a very young woman might become pregnant, an adolescent or a teenager. I was just looking on the World Health Organization's website, and they say that the leading cause of death for 15 to 19-year-olds worldwide is complications from pregnancy and childbirth. So now some of that could be avoided if these young girls either had access to a better equipped hospital or medical care or contraception. But we have to remember that carrying a child to term pregnancy and carrying a child to term and childbirth carries some medical risks. Women, for many, many centuries have died in childbirth, and we're lucky that fewer of them do today with a well-equipped hospital. There might be also just more mundane health reasons. A woman who's had multiple pregnancies and gone through childbirth, let's say, 3 or 4 children within a short space of time with only a couple months between each pregnancy, may accidentally get pregnant again, and her body just may need time to recover if she's having too many pregnancies in a row. And so there are just a lot of different reasons. Older women who have all different health conditions can still accidentally get pregnant. Someone in her, I know a woman in her 40s and who have other various health conditions, whether it's high blood pressure and other things that could make a pregnancy dangerous. So there are lots of different health reasons. Of course, I haven't even started with the mental health reasons. Women who have been raped and become pregnant, or just again, young women in general, an adolescent with an unwanted pregnancy. So these are the medical reasons. The issue of, does this give women a right to an abortion? I would say the rights are never absolute and unconditional. So yes, in some circumstances, not again, for at any moment on demand, but in some circumstances, and I would say women have a somewhat limited right to access abortion services. And we can talk about it later on. Some of the other questions we'll get into how we will limit that right, if at all. Some people don't feel the right should be limited. Some people feel it should be highly restricted. I think the harder positions we are trying to carve out are the ones in the middle. Can we allow some abortions, not allow others? Which ones? And what's a good way to do that politically, ethically? That's what we'll get into in this discussion. So let me just stop there for now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Professor Moschella, what do you think about that?
Oh, unmute yourself.
Oh, no. Oh, there we go. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I am just going to reach down. I thought that my laptop was plugged in, but it turned out that something else was in that outlet. And so now I am going to reach down and plug it in so that I don't run out of battery in the middle. There we go. Okay. So, I mean, first I want to echo Laurie's thanks. I mean, I think we don't have these kinds of conversations enough where, we're actually honestly engaging the core issues and talking to each other respectfully and civilly, and not talking past each other or talking in our own little echo chambers. So again, thank you for organizing this, and thanks to Laurie for participating. And I actually agree with a lot of what Laurie said at the beginning. So I agree that there are cases which, philosophically, these are kind of grouped as what are sometimes called vital conflict cases, where you have basically one life versus another life, where perhaps both can't be saved, and you may need to make a choice, right? And those could be, very hard cases of, as Laurie mentioned, a woman who has, say, uterine cancer, right, discovers that while pregnant and needs treatment, and obviously that treatment would not be consistent with continuing the pregnancy. Other cases even more difficult, like, as she said, somebody with, there was a controversial case in Phoenix a few years ago of a woman with very severe pulmonary hypertension, for whom the continuation of the pregnancy put such a strain on her body that her body simply could not take, such that she would die and the unborn child would die prior to viability if they didn't do some kind of intervention. So I think that in cases like that, what you're dealing with is an application of what's called the principle of double effect, which is the principle. I mean, very often people hear about this, say, in military ethics, where, generally it's presumed that it's wrong to target civilians in warfare, but it can be accepted to, say, go for a really important military target, even if there are some civilians that are going to be nearby and might be impacted or even killed by the bombing, if there's a proportionate reason for that, right? If it's not unfair to accept that amount of civilian casualties for the sake of the military target. And sometimes, people have fleshed that fairness aspect out by saying, would you be willing to do that if it weren't, enemy civilians there, but maybe some of your own nationals living in the country who would be negatively impacted, right? That's the kind of fairness test that we might want to do in terms of looking at whether this acceptance of death to non-combatants as a side effect is acceptable. I think you do basically the exact same analysis when you're dealing with situations where the mother's life requires an intervention. Saving the mother's life requires an intervention that would result in the death of the unborn child. And so, in that case, again, the procedure that you're doing, the intervention that you're doing, is not intended to kill the child either as an end or as a means, right? Your point is not at all to have the child be dead, right? Your point is simply to remove whatever life-threatening burden on the woman's body exists that's somehow, tangentially perhaps related to the pregnancy or to some other condition like cancer, which can't be treated while the woman remains pregnant. And in cases where the woman's life itself is at stake, it's clear that there's no fairness issue, right? That, if you were, I think one way of looking at this is if you were to turn the tables and ask, if the unborn child could speak, if you could ask, right? Or many religious people might think about meeting that child later on in heaven, right? And, that if you were to meet that child later on who died because, they were going to die anyway, and otherwise you would have died too, or because it was necessary to treat a cancer, I think you would meet that child with peace, and the child would say, I completely understand your decision. I would have made the same decision. I would have wanted you to make that decision. And I think that's where there's a famous case in the literature that probably most people interested in this topic have heard about, the violinist case that Judith Jarvis Thompson brings up, where she says abortion is kind of like being kidnapped and then waking up in a hospital with a violinist that has famous violinist with kidney failure has been hooked up to you, and you're basically serving as live dialysis for this violinist. And the doctors say, well, we're very sorry this happened to you. They ought never to have kidnapped you and hooked you up to this guy to try to save him, but they did, and now here you are. But don't worry, after 9 months, it'll all be fine, and then you can go home. Right, and she says, we think we all agree that it would be ethical to unhook from the violinist, even if it means that he would die. And she thinks that proves that bodily autonomy implies a right to sometimes kill another person. There are many flaws with that argument, as even many pro-choicers have pointed out. But I think actually the argument is a good argument for these vital conflict cases, where the death is not intentional, as it wouldn't be if you're unplugging from the violinist, and where there's a proportionate reason. And I think the reason would need to be a bit stronger in the pregnancy case than the violinist case, because the child is your child and you have obligations to your children that you don't have to strangers.
Okay.
So that's, I can stop there and just say one last basic point, which is that bodily autonomy is obviously an important right, but that with abortion, we have two bodies, right? Scientifically, medically speaking, the intervention that is going on with an abortion is, in the typical case, aimed directly at the death of the child. And, generally our bodily autonomy is limited by the rights of others, particularly very basic rights like the right not to be intentionally killed.
Okay, so it sounds like both of you agree about medically necessary abortion. And so we want to focus the conversation now more on elective procedures, areas in which that direct conflict that Professor Moschella is talking about here might be more questionable. And so we want to open this up now to further debate between the two of you. And maybe you can both elaborate a little bit more on where you feel that elective abortion fits into bodily integrity and autonomy, and whether that's implied in women's rights. So Professor Shrage, we'd like to hear from you first.
For me?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
So there's a question of, human life and fetal life, and then there's a question of personhood, and that's a more philosophical and difficult question. And it's hard to get agreement on when fetuses acquire personhood and therefore all the rights of person. I don't think there's one right answer, and I do think that people from different philosophical, religious perspectives will have a different answer. For me, so you notice I would not use the term unborn child because it's to me, kind of a emotionally loaded term. I'm a mother. I have 2 children. I can't imagine anything happening to their lives. But I consider an embryo in the first few weeks of pregnancy, and a fetus is not, to me, yet a person. And for me, personhood begins when there's something like some kind of conscious activity. And we can debate when in a pregnancy there's enough conscious activity or brain waves. But so that's why I think that my own view is that we should have less restrictions earlier in a pregnancy when the fetus and the embryo are less developed and seem to have fewer of the characteristics we associate with person. But once you get to the second half of pregnancy, where the fetus has already acquired many of the characteristics we associate with pregnancy, the ability to respond, potentially feel pain and all of that, then respect for fetal life requires more restrictions. So we'll get into it probably with some of the other questions. I actually am one of the few, I mean, I consider myself in some sense pro-choice and pro-life. I mean, who could not be pro-life, right? I mean, I think we should protect human life, but I also feel that there are moments when not all lives can be saved. And so we might have to prioritize, and it's sad. And we're in a situation, where not all lives can be saved in this pandemic. Not all lives can be saved around the world, for all sorts of reasons, for poverty. So sometimes, sometimes I think we have to prioritize the person in this case. We might have two bodies involved, but sometimes there's only one person, and that's the pregnant woman, at least till till a certain stage of pregnancy. So for all cases of pregnancy, I think we should have some short period of pretty much unrestricted access. I don't know how short it should be. Some countries it's 8 weeks, some countries it's 12 weeks. Then some period of moderately restricted access. The reasons have to get stronger as the pregnancy goes on. And by the time we get to the later stages, there really almost isn't a need for certainly an abortion, and even in a pregnancy termination would be very dangerous both to the woman and to the fetus. And so again, often the procedures get more dangerous as the pregnancy goes on, and so the benefit, and also the pregnancy doesn't have that much more time. So the benefits of ending a pregnancy and a healthy pregnancy don't outweigh just taking the pregnancy to term as you get into toward the very last trimester of pregnancy.
Thank you. Professor Moschella, what do you think?
So two things. First, just briefly, because I didn't have time to respond to this aspect of Laurie's original comments about whether there's a kind of general public health need, women's health need for access to legal elective abortion. I think it is telling to look at comparative international studies on this, where we look at places like, for instance, Chile had a period in its history where abortion was legal and then it was made illegal. And so it's a very interesting case study to see, did maternal mortality increase after it was made illegal? And in fact, it did not. Maternal mortality decreased about fourfold after abortion was made illegal. And at the time, just to put this in context, the overall maternal mortality rate that Chile had was also lower than the United States, and the lowest as in all of Latin America. So it wasn't that it was in general high or bad. And if you look at, say, Ireland before abortion was legalized there, by comparison with England and Scotland right next door where abortion was legal, maternal mortality rates were 5 to 10 times lower in Ireland than in England and Scotland at that time. Obviously, there's travel abortion, tourism abortion that was possible because of the proximity of England and Scotland. But again, in general, I think it makes you wonder, right? What is it about a health system where abortion is considered healthcare and therefore fertility, women's fertility, treated as a disease, that somehow leads to correlations with higher maternal mortality? I mean, maybe if the resources that were put into supporting, for advocating, lobbying for abortion and so on, or even just the provision of it, were put into providing better access to proper, prenatal and postnatal care for all women, we would see overall reductions in maternal mortality. So that's just one thing to bring up. On the personhood question, I see that we're bleeding into what is supposed to be the topic of the next question. I presume that that's fine. Sure. I think that Laurie is absolutely right that at the core of the question of the ethics of elective abortion, right, apart from these vital conflict kind of cases, is the question of whether prior to birth, a human being is a person, that is somebody with full moral status, with the same kind of rights that you and I and other adult humans have. My view on that is that, logically there are two basic possibilities. Either every human organism, right, every biological human being is a human person, and therefore, right, has the same kind of moral status as every other human person, regardless of state of dependency or disability or illness or whatever it might be. The second possibility is that only some human beings are human persons, and therefore the definition of personhood has to kind of be defined by whether or not the human being possesses the requisite capacities that make somebody a person, whether that be the capacities for, people have talked about language use, rationality, consciousness, self-awareness, things like that. And I think what's very tricky and to me troublesome about the second option, where not every human being is a person, is that there are first of all going to be no bright lines there, and that the separation between human being and person. I'm not saying that this is the same in all respects, but it has a long and very sordid history, right? I mean, the Dred Scott decision, one of the most infamous, right, Supreme Court decisions said that, well, yes, Black people are human, but they're not persons, and therefore they don't deserve equal protection under the law. And the same with the Holocaust, right? One of the greatest atrocities in history was basically denying a full moral status to Jews, the disabled, others. And so, I think so many of the atrocities in history have been perpetrated, have been rationalized by denying the status of personhood to a whole class of people for better or worse reasons, right? Now, I mean, obviously, the obviousness of the full humanity of a Black person or a Jewish person or whatever makes those denials of personhood, I think, much more difficult to defend, right, than a denial of personhood to an embryo or an early fetus, where the capacities, the personhood of that a human being at that early stage is much less obvious to us. So it takes a little more digging deep philosophically to understand why, as I think is true, that personhood does begin at the beginning of human organismal life. And I think that's because we need to think about personhood as something that's based on not what kind of capacities you can exercise right now, whether I can speak to you right now, whether I can engage in rational thinking or am conscious right now, but whether I am the kind of being that has the kind of basic natural capacity or root capacity for those person-defining characteristics like rationality and language and so on. And I think it's clear that every human organism is the kind of being that has the root capacity for that. And any, beginning at conception, the zygote and then embryo and then fetus has everything, right? All of the epigenetic and genetic capacities to direct itself toward full human maturity. And there's basically no bright line change that occurs in that trajectory of development from conception onward, right? The bright line change occurs at fertilization, where egg and sperm, which had one trajectory, now begin to have a totally new trajectory because a new thing has come into being with the unique genetic code and all the structures to develop itself toward full maturity. And so if we want personhood to be based on immediately exercisable capacities, it's not clear why personhood should begin even at birth. And many of the pro-choice philosophers, mainstream, like Peter Singer, Marianne Warren, Tooley, Jeff McMahon, lots of people, I mean, they say, well, yeah, I mean, birth is arbitrary. And honestly, after birth abortion or infanticide, which has been openly defended, it should be okay for the same reasons, because the infant is also not a person.
Okay, I think this is great that Professor Moschella has gone into the second part of our discussion, which is we wanted the panelists to characterize who the unborn are and how they see the entity within the womb. And so we see Professor Moschella invoking scientific criteria in that. And so maybe for Professor Shrage, you could get it to, I know you had said that there's a sort of a broad room there for defining, but maybe you could get into where you think that individual rights should begin. And especially when you were saying how abortion later into pregnancy is not necessary for the health of the mother, can actually be contraindicated. Can you maybe discuss how you feel about later term abortion for fetal diagnosis, even though that's not necessarily the main reason that the data shows why those are happening, that does seem to be a primary defense that pro-choice people give for later term abortion. And really, if you could address anything else here that within this category of who or what the unborn are in response to Professor Moschella, that'd be great.
Okay, you want me to do this, respond to those now? Let me just say I agree with Melissa that there isn't a bright line, and I don't even think conception is really a bright line. But I think that there's no special significance for me at that point. Although it's true, something very amazing happens at conception. But I would accept the challenge that somehow we have to define personhood in terms of some other set of criteria. And I'm even open to think, and there are people now, in the legal profession who are trying to even establish legal personhood for certain kind of high level mammals. And I actually think that's actually in order to protect certain populations of, elephants or, great apes. So personhood isn't necessary. So that's another thing. Some people think only humans can be persons, and some people feel that's, going back to people like Peter Singer, that's too human centric, and that we need to have even a broader notion of what a person is. I don't necessarily take the position. I think it's also somewhat, in some ways just as arbitrary to say personhood starts at birth. In terms of the criteria, I don't see birth can happen, happens. It can happen earlier in sometimes it's a baby is born premature, but, and survives. And Melissa raised the issue of disability, which some of the philosophers like Peter Singer have not dealt well with. And so we got to define personhood so that includes a wide range of people, as I said, including higher level animals, but who might not have, yet all of the traits we tend to think of are, indicative of being a person. It's a very, very hard question. The problem is we do have to come up with even if morally we can't answer the question, which I think it's really difficult to answer morally what a person is. For legal purposes, we have to come up with some policies that we can agree to. And I would be willing to say, look, even, let's say a fetus might at some point acquire even legal personhood in the late part of pregnancy. And then that might change what kinds of policies we have in terms of, I certainly don't see that elective abortions are necessary after, 24 weeks, or that we should have policies that, any abortion in that part of pregnancy needs to have some kind of very strong justification. And a lot of times, and this is right, sometimes feminists use the fact that the fetus is very damaged. And there are cases where I think a very damaged fetus, like one that doesn't have a brain, just a brain stem, that would be a justification for an abortion. But one that's just diagnosed with Down syndrome, that to me isn't a justification. So it's a very difficult line to draw. And I think we have to be very sensitive to the disability rights movement and, to where we would draw the line there in terms of which fetuses we would protect. It's the same thing with, somebody who's in a coma or an irreversible coma, right? We have the same end of life problems. At what point can we remove life support, right? And we should be protective, make sure there are no abuses, that people make sure that for whatever reasons we're using, they're in the best interest of the person whose lives are at stake and the humans. I also want to say that I think even if fetuses don't qualify for personhood at some earlier point in pregnancy, they certainly deserve some form of state protection. I mean, we give state protection to historical buildings or to certain forests or to all kinds of things that we consider precious and unique. And so I certainly think we can protect fetal life without awarding fetuses full personhood status. And that's why I'm more in favor of a more sort of gradual approach to abortion, early in a pregnancy, where it's pregnancy can happen for all kinds of reasons. I try not to be too judgmental, but I hope most people are trying, if they don't desire a child, they're doing everything they can to avoid pregnancy. So we need to, focus on that. But if there is an accidental pregnancy and for whatever reason the pregnancy it's just something that the pregnant woman is, feels she can't go through, we should have a kind of gradualistic approach where earlier in the pregnancy there are more options, and then those options kind of go away as you go on in a pregnancy. And that will mean some women will not be able to get abortions, and I'm willing to live with that. Like if it goes beyond a certain stage, there will be women who still, there are cases where a woman might not know she's pregnant, and abortion goes into a later stage. It's healthy. I mean, I don't think, if we want to compromise on this issue, and I do think we should be looking for a compromise and not an all-out victory, we'll have to say there are going to be, some abortions won't be, abortion services won't be available, and some will, right? In some circumstances, they will. It's the hardest part is to define when they should be available to a woman who wants it, and at what point her options should be limited.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, Michelle's going to ask the last two questions here.
Yes, we're running out of time always, right? And you all elegantly answered so much of what's in question 3 and 4, but I'll read them anyways. And hopefully the two of you can comment on maybe areas that we haven't yet covered. So how can we balance a pregnant woman's right to bodily autonomy and respect for fetal human lives? We did touch on that. And should we, and is this even possible? And Dr. Moschella, I'd like to start with you.
Great. So, I mean, I think, obviously, as I mentioned before, the right to bodily autonomy is a very important right. It's certainly an important right, particularly in medical care, but in other arenas as well. But again, that right is always limited by the rights of others, the equally fundamental rights of others. So, if I'm an aspiring actress and just get offered a big break contract for a movie and then discover that I'm pregnant, and the producer says to me, get an abortion or you lose the part because you need to be thin, for the next year, and, does that justify getting an abortion? Even if, I think in that case, people might disagree about this. I think in that case, the abortion might not actually be intentional killing. It might simply be wanting to not be pregnant. Just as, in the kind of medical pulmonary hypertension case where the issue is the pregnancy itself, not actually the life of the child. But is that okay, even if it's not intentional killing? But it just seems unfair to say, well, I'm going to sacrifice your life for my career move. I think on just that kind of fairness aspect of double effect, any situation other than a situation where the woman's life itself is at stake would not be sufficient grounds to justify even a kind of non-intentional ending of a pregnancy where the death of the child is unintended. But I think we need to be clear that in the vast majority of abortions, despite the kind of euphemisms that are typically used, terminating a pregnancy and things like that, it's not really about terminating a pregnancy, or it's not really about not wanting to be pregnant or wanting to avoid the burdens of pregnancy itself. I mean, most women, when they're, for instance, presented with the option, well, you could have the child, place the child for adoption and so on. The point is they don't want a child out there. They don't want the responsibility of being a parent even if they don't have to actually take that on, right? Just knowing that your child is out there and you can't raise it, it feels too hard for many women. And so they prefer the choice of abortion. But that's clearly a choice to kill the child. Even though we don't like to think about it that way, I think psychologically most women seeking abortions don't put it to themselves that way. But that honestly is what's going on, right? The death of the child is the goal, which is why, typically, pro-choicers kind of extreme on the political left will not even vote in favor of born alive infant protection acts, where a child accidentally survives a late term abortion. They want those children to be killed, right? Because the point of the abortion really is to kill the child, not just to have the woman be unpregnant, right? And so if that's the case, and if the right to life is, I think, arguably one of our most basic rights, right? The right not to be intentionally killed, then I think there are no cases where the right to bodily autonomy would justify an elective abortion, right? A true abortion where the point is to intentionally to end the life of the child, and where the life of the mother is not at stake. And that's because, as I said before, I don't think that there's any other coherent way to answer the question of moral status of who is a person, other than to say every biological human being is a person. Because the problems with basing personhood on immediately exercisable capacities are many, including it's hard to do that without saying that disabled, severely cognitively disabled, for instance, are not persons. It's hard to do that and be coherent, right? And also that if your personhood is dependent upon not the kind of thing that you are, but what you can do, there seems to be no reason to accord equal moral status to even all adult human beings. I mean, some people are much more talented, have much more of the kind of rational capacities that we think are distinctly worthy of respect than others do, right? So, Einstein would have been much higher on the right scale than somebody of average intelligence. And so again, I just don't see how, if we want to have a actually coherent account of when people are accorded rights, that there's any alternative but to say everybody who is the type of being that is rational, everybody with human nature, therefore ought to have the same rights.
Thank you, Professor Moschella. Thank you so much for that.
Can I jump in here and just say?
Of course, I wanted just to say that we have 2 minutes. Dr. Shrage, I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes to respond. I'm hoping that you'll touch on where the woman's right to bodily integrity outweighs any rights of the, I'm going to say, unborn child or fetus, even during those early moments of pregnancy in the context of elective abortion. And so you've got 2 minutes, please, and then we're going to go into audience Q&A. Thank you.
So first, I want to say I agree about the accidental live birth cases. I think that's where actually the concept of viability came from, that if the fetus is viable, or that at that point the born child is viable, the mother and the doctor do not have the right to euthanize it. But that puts a burden on everyone else to decide what kind of care that now prematurely born infant, who might have all kinds of medical needs, will get. So it's a very tricky situation. I think the decision to have an abortion is always going to be a difficult decision. I don't think we should trivialize it, and I don't think we should treat it like birth control. And so I actually think that some of the protections that we have for end-of-life decisions, where we want to make sure people are making, if they don't want, extra, ordinary care, and they decide to decline it, make sure they're doing it for their own reasons. They're not being pressured by family or whatever. Similarly, if a woman decides to have an abortion, I think we have to have the same safeguards in place to make sure this isn't a decision she's going to eventually regret, that she's going to, give her time to make a difficult decision. On the other hand, sometimes that increases the costs, of when you have waiting periods. But I'm one of these people, I'm open to some of these safeguards. I don't think they're all malicious or badly intentioned. But it's a difficult choice. And sometimes what I feel, again, is because I don't see an embryo as a full person. I do think it's when a child is wanted, an embryo is a magical thing, right? But in a case where pregnancy is a huge burden, whether it's physically, mentally, psychologically, it's a very different thing. And I don't think we can, at that point, I think we have to try to respect a woman's autonomy to a point. And I think, again, we agree that this is not an absolute right. It's very much a contingent and limited right. And so the question is how we're going to limit the right and how much we're going to limit the right. I would probably limit it less than Professor Moschella, but we're within a range of, I think, I could accept some limit. And again, I do think because we have wide moral and religious differences on this, we're just going to have to eventually compromise. Nobody is going to get everything they want, right? Some people will wish for a more permissive policy. Some people will wish for less. We've got to strike a place in the middle. And I will admit, I don't think Roe did that. And so, but on the other hand, I think what feminists like me worry about is if Roe's overturned, we'll get then more draconian policies rather than something more moderate and in the middle. But Roe does not allow restricting pregnancy in the second trimester, and I think that's one of the problems that bothered a lot of people with Roe. That you can't restrict you can't restrict abortion to protect the fetus, only to preserve the mother's health. So I think a lot of people feel there need to be more restrictions a little bit earlier on than what the Roe regulatory scheme devised. But what the perfect scheme is, I think we should look at what other countries are doing that have a more restrictive scheme than us, but also allows for some abortions. And again, which ones we're going to allow. So for me, it's always the earlier, that's better, the earlier in a pregnancy. And then as a pregnancy moves on, there need to be more justifications. And I think the justifications will vary. And I agree that the intention behind this is not necessarily to end the life of the embryo or fetus. It's simply to end the pregnancy. One last thought, just to throw another ripple. If we ever have the technology to remove a fetus before viability, or essentially have viability occur at a much earlier stage, that'll really test whether we really, So imagine we could remove a 5-week-old embryo and transplant it in another woman's womb, or as we now can do with fertilized eggs, or in some kind of extrauterine device. What would we do? Would we, if a woman wanted to end a pregnancy, and we might be moving toward that future. Would we do everything we can to keep that, fetus embryo alive, or would we have a cutoff and say only if it's at a certain age? So there's some difficult decisions. I think ultimately life is precious. We should support as much of it as we can, but sometimes we can't. It would be such a burden to the people we're asking that we can't ask them to do that and interfere with their autonomy.
Thank you, Dr. Shrage. Thank you so much for your response. It's nuanced, and this is a complicated matter. And I know we just wholeheartedly appreciate both of your willingness to engage. I'm going to kick off the Q&A period, and then Cecelia is going to take it from there. We only have 10 minutes. The first question I'll put out to Dr. Moschella, and then obviously we would want you to respond, Dr. Shrage, as well. But it's, what does the expression "my body, my choice" mean from your philosophical and practical perspective?
So, I mean, the expression "my body, my choice" is meant to capture the idea that the right to bodily autonomy, to control your own body, implies that you therefore have the right to choose to end your pregnancy. I mean, the basic flaw in that expression, as I've mentioned already, is that even though the unborn child is inside your body, it's not your body. I mean, it's a completely different, genetically, it's a totally different organism. I mean, in fact, even very early after conception, the new embryo needs to kind of send out biochemical signals to the mother's body so that her immune system doesn't attack it, because the mother's body recognizes this is not me, right? As it's very clear that even though the embryo, is meant to be there, I mean, it's a part of the healthy functioning of the woman's reproductive system that she can gestate a child, it's not her, right? It's not her body. So my body, my choice is just, too simplistic. I mean, a part of it is getting at the idea of the burdens of pregnancy and so on, the things that Laurie was talking about. But I think, that the burden argument, well, I mean, obviously, I sympathize, particularly in very hard cases. The burden argument is really more about the burdens of an unwanted child than about the burdens of an unwanted pregnancy per se. And frankly, children are much more burdensome after they're born than before in the vast majority of cases. And so the burden argument could extend, logically, would extend to if you decide you don't want your child at 3 months or 1 month, or the child is born and turns out to be sick and you weren't really into that idea, right? You wanted a healthy child, not a sick one, or your husband leaves you all of a sudden and you're in a different circumstance, or lots of reasons why, you lose all your money, you're dirt poor, and now you have a baby, what are you going to do? All the sorts of reasons that people give for kind of saying, oh, in this case, we should allow for abortion. I mean, those same reasons would hold for killing a child after birth. So I think, if we take it seriously that it's human life, then we need to think about trying to save that life and protecting that life from being intentionally killed.
Excellent. Dr. Shrage, what say you?
Okay, so I agree that we should focus on the burdens of pregnancy and not the burdens of the child to the woman should it survive, and that's why I think this is going to be a very hard case when viability perhaps gets moved to an earlier stage of pregnancy. I don't think, one thing we should imagine, pregnancy does pose for many women certain health risks. The fetus, what your body is working at, 150% of capacity. The fetus is using all of your bodily systems to process its own waste. It's for anyone who's been through it. Again, when it's a wanted pregnancy, it's an amazing thing. It's a beautiful experience. When it's not a wanted situation, it does place certain health risks on a woman that I think, and again, depending on what kind of access to healthcare she has, taking a pregnancy to term and childbirth, this is what actually influenced the Roe court, poses greater health risks to a woman than an abortion in the first trimester. And that only happened in the middle of the 20th century, where abortion procedures actually became safe enough that the risk of a first trimester abortion was actually quite low, performed in hygienic conditions in a well-equipped hospital. Up until abortions could be performed safely, there were good reasons to not allow doctors to perform them, because women would die from abortion procedures if they were performed badly. And the abortion procedures, really until the mid-20th century, really were not that safe. So when they became safe enough that they became safer for a woman, at least in the beginning, an early abortion, than pregnancy itself, and still is, we still have a lot of women who die from complication, especially minority women who, it could be lack of access to healthcare, it could be another number of reasons, but still a surprising number of women in first world countries die from complications of pregnancy and childbirth. So I'm not willing to, I value the pregnant woman's life as much as the fetus's life. And I don't think in that situation, I can impose on a woman and say, you have to assume these risks of completing a pregnancy and childbirth, which are greater than a first trimester abortion. You have to assume these risks because I think this embryo at 6 weeks old or 7 weeks old is that their life is as deserves as much protection as yours. I don't think that's the case. I think that that's because of the fact that pregnancy and childbirth for some women, and this is even in a healthy pregnancy, by the way, we don't always know which pregnancies will become complicated, or especially in the later stages, or when childbirth will become complicated, and a woman will die afterwards. There are women who've died from complications of childbirth who had perfectly healthy pregnancies. So we're asking women to take on that risk when they could get another procedure early on that's much less risky to their health. To me, once the abortion procedure is as risky as the pregnancy and childbirth, it's a different story. Then what we're asking a woman to do is less, burdensome and onerous. And especially as we get to the end of pregnancy, when there's not much time left, and the procedure is even, the abortion procedure is more dangerous even than just natural, childbirth at the end of term. I think we have to be very skeptical of those kind of requests, and most of the time turn them down unless, again, there's a major health reason. So, again, for me, the health risks are paramount, and I think, unfortunately, abortion became more of an issue of a woman's freedom and autonomy, and really what we need to focus on are the health issues. And make the kind of decisions that, as Professor Moschella knows, that biomedical ethicists deal with all the time, these balancing issues. And we should look at the issue from the point of view of medical ethics and less from the point of view of these other political issues.
Excellent.
If I could just say one thing briefly there, because it's been a lot about health, that I think it's important to note that there are health risks to abortion as well. I mean, first trimester abortions are very safe. I mean, when done well, of course, in general, but there could be long-term health effects of them. There have been studies that have connected particularly multiple abortions, but even just one, to a higher incidence of later ectopic pregnancy, which one of the greatest maternal mortality risks. Studies have found that in Denmark, for instance, a recent study that compared to women who delivered, women who had an abortion had much higher mortality rates within 1 through 10 years for all causes, that the psychological trauma that not always, but very often follows abortion can be very considerable. So I just want to put that in there, that abortion itself has risks both for physical and mental
especially
health.
in the second trimester when there's a risk of perforating the uterus and other things. So the risks increase. First trimester, yes, everything it has risks, but from what I'm not a doctor, and the studies, one has to keep looking at them, and these things are always changing. But at a certain point, I think in the 20th century, first trimester abortions, as they're now performed in a hospital or a doctor or wherever in a clinic, are in fact pretty safe. And on the other hand, childbirth is still not as safe as it should be. Now, maybe the answer is to make childbirth much safer.
Well, I agree with that. Yes.
So, I would like to see us focus on that because way too many women still either die or have long-term health issues after childbirth.
Okay, professors, we have 1 minute left, so we're obviously going to go just a bit over. Cecelia has the last question that she wants to pose to the two of you. Are you all okay hanging out for about 5 minutes after? Excellent. So let's see.
So the question is regarding how consent plays into the aspect of pregnancy. Considering most pregnancies are healthy and the result of consensual sex, what responsibility is there for pregnancy that results from consensual sex? So Professor Shrage, you're talking about how there's all these risks, but a lot of these risks are known prior to the act of conception, and people freely engage in the act that creates the new and known to be dependent human child.
Right. So I don't think, again, first of all, sex that results in a pregnancy usually involves more than one person. So it's not just the woman herself. So I would assign some responsibility to her partner. And I certainly hope that any fertile couple who does not wish to raise a child does whatever they need to do to avoid pregnancy. But you can be engaged in an activity and still not be responsible for all the consequences. For just a very simple example, I drive every day. If I had an accident and hurt someone, I would be responsible, but I didn't, intend that. There's a degree of, my responsibility for that is limited. That's why we call it an accident, right? I don't go to jail for it. That's the other thing we also need to consider is when we criminalize abortion, there are also consequences. Doctors or pregnant women are going to go to jail, and that is not good for anyone as far as I'm concerned either. So we have to also think about the consequences of prohibition. But when an accident occurs, yes, we can be responsible in a sense. We caused an accident, but that doesn't mean you have to accept all the, the most, that you should be punished necessarily, or that you don't have any options. That's why we have insurance schemes. And I think of, to some extent, early abortion as an insurance scheme. It's not one I would recommend. I would much prefer that people were much more rigorous about using birth control. But if an accident happens, I think people have to have some degree of options to deal with it without and not be. We shouldn't be too terribly punitive, saying, "Okay, you had sex, and therefore you have to pay for it with a pregnancy." I don't think that should be our response.
Okay, Professor Moschella, would you give the last word on this?
Sure. I mean, I think that while it's true that we're not responsible for all the consequences of our actions, I think that's primarily the case when those consequences are kind of incidental to the action. So, driving is not a kind of activity that's defined by a kind of aim at killing people, right? It's defined by an aim at getting places, right? Sex, we have to remember that sex is short for sexual reproduction. Right? I mean, sex is the baby-making activity. Now, obviously, the widespread use of birth control and the culture has separated that in people's minds, but I think that that's actually quite bad and quite false, that we need to recognize that sex is sexual reproduction. It's a reproductive type of activity. And so that if you're engaging in sex, that it's simply irresponsible to be engaging in sex if you're not willing to or prepared to accept the consequences of that, the natural consequences of that, and no birth control is 100% effective. So, I do think that, part of the problem here is a culture where people are told that they ought to be able to have consequence-free sex at any time with no responsibility because there's birth control and because there's abortion to back it up. And it's a culture that I think, frankly, and the empirical research seems to show this, is terrible for women, right? And, there are obviously individual differences, but by and large, women don't want uncommitted sex. Women want, stable long-term partnership, and they'll often allow men to have sex with them because they feel it's the only way to enter the dating market or get somebody to stay around. Whereas, a scenario where actually women could have the excuse, quote unquote, I might get pregnant, let's not have sex, might actually help them out. And a scenario where abortion on demand were not so obvious would actually make it easier in a way to tell the father, you're equally responsible. Because it's hard to tell the father, you're equally responsible to care for this child when they don't have a choice in whether or not to keep pregnancy. Right? I mean, the woman's the only one who gets to choose, and he can tell her, well, hey, you want to care for the child, fine, have the child, but then it's your responsibility. I'm not agreeing with that. But in a regime of elective abortion available on demand at any time, it's much harder to hold men accountable. So, I think the broader societal effects of this in terms of, what women really want in terms of relationships, dating, family, and so on, are also, quite harmful to women's interests, and we need to think about that from that broader perspective.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yes, please. Actually, I'm just going to tell you, we would love you both to say anything that you haven't felt was covered in the last few minutes. Please take a,
So it's true that sex is short for sexual reproduction, but I think sex is also important for many other things, for a kind of bonding among, couples, for a certain form of pleasure, relaxation. People have perhaps a life of sexual activity, but only at a very small part of their lives are they engaged in reproductive sex. I mean, I have 2 children, and it was wonderful, and it was a lot of fun, conceiving and exciting to conceive, and these were planned, and it was a lot of fun. But once we had 2 children, and that was enough, I wasn't going to give up sex So I don't think we can expect people to, there's sex is important in the life of people. Sex that could end up with a pregnancy, even when people aren't intending to have a child. And people often, have children at a certain stage of life, but then remain sexually active and even fertile for much longer. And so I think it's, to say that people should not have sex unless they are willing to deal with the reproductive consequences. I think first of all, accidental pregnancies should really be rare. And when they do happen, they should be dealt with responsibly and as quickly as possible. And all alternatives should be considered. I don't think that, any one alternative should be promoted. And I think there are, again, like as we do with end of life decisions, one part of autonomy is making sure a woman is making that decision autonomously, whether it's to abort or to carry on a pregnancy. So, I just think that, yes, sex can be reproductive, but most of our lives we're not engaged in reproductive sex. And I don't want to be, too puritanical about it and say, people really shouldn't have sex unless they're prepared, to deal with all the consequences, including an accidental pregnancy.
Professor Shrage, is there anything else that you'd like to finish with before we give Professor Moschella the last word there?
That was pretty much. I just was responding to that last point. I realize we're over time.
No, it's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just briefly to respond to that. I mean, obviously, I don't mean to say that you shouldn't have sex unless you're intending to have a baby, but I think there's a context, right? I mean, so somebody might not be, intending to have a baby. They might be taking steps to avoid having a baby. But if you're an adult, financially stable, hopefully married with a stable partner, you could still have that baby, right? I mean, you're in a scenario where even if it might not be the thing that you really want, you could responsibly take care of that child or give the child up for adoption. That's what I mean, that you should be in a scenario where should an accidental pregnancy occur, you could do justice to that child and take care of the child, right? And I think, more broadly, to go back to the sort of women's health concerns more broadly, I do think and I think this is an area of common cause, I would imagine, that we need to think about the ways in which a healthcare system that has focused so myopically on birth control and abortion as basically the sum total of women's healthcare, and has forgotten about actually understanding the woman's cycle and trying to optimize it for general health reasons, and also to have a natural way to regulate birth that doesn't involve all these hormones with side effects and so on. I mean, I think that that's something really important to think about. It could be one of the reasons why maternal mortality and morbidity remains high, is that much of healthcare research, has been on men's bodies, and that a lot of the research that could and should be done about specifically women's health is not done because birth control is used as the kind of fix-all for any women's health complaint. And it doesn't fix anything, of course. It just shuts down a cycle. And people who have done more natural procreative technologies work, they say that, after they went through their first standard medical training and then, later on were introduced to these more natural fertility awareness-based methods, that they learned more in a 1-hour introductory session to natural procreative technologies than in all of medical school and residency about women's health. And that to me is just, that's crazy, right? And so I think we really want to do more to change the way that doctors are trained, particularly OBGYNs, but in general, so that they actually understand and respect the women's cycle and as a vital sign, which it is. Right. And so that women can be empowered to understand their own fertility and control it naturally if they don't want to do it through hormonal birth control.
All right, excellent. I just want to say there's so much to talk about. And, obviously, and there's so many questions that we still have unanswered. I just want to thank you wholeheartedly for being here with us, for this opportunity to really engage in the civic conversation. And we just really look forward to seeing everyone on episode 3. Stay tuned, and just thanks from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you for organizing this. It's very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both. This has been wonderful.
Thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.